the pelican birds. They have black tips on their wings. They land out in the middle of this, and then pretty soon they'll all start flying over to one of the banks. So I'm going to try to read to you while we watch them come in and go out. Let me see how much closer I can get us. There we go. I know it's a little shaky, but you know, birds, guys. All right. Thank you for being with me. I'm reading to you from the Etta James book. I think we are at chapter 24. Yep, chapter 24. The chicken is heroin. Dorothy disliked Artis Mills. She called him Chaka Zulu and swore the man would be my ruination. I loved my mother. I will always love her. But she really hadn't changed. She was still moving from motel to motel, never staying in one place for more than one night. When I was a kid, her lifestyle held glamour. There we go. And mystery for me. Now, though, her unpredictable patterns were tiresome. I couldn't count on her any more than I could count on myself, for stability. Dorothy was part of my crazy household, though, along with the hippies and the drag queens and my husband and child. Part of the reason I'd been pissed at my mother had to do with the fort. Every now and then she'd try to sell it and get the money. Billy had done the same thing. Well, I told you how years before Leonard Chess had stepped in and put the house under his name. When that happened, lots of folks said, "Etta, you have made a mistake. You've gone and trusted a goddamn record company owner. You'll never see that deed again." All this time, even though he held the mortgage, Leonard would charge me for the monthly payments. When I couldn't make those payments, my other guardian angel, Uncle Frank, would loan me the bread. In the back of my mind, though, I wondered whether I had, in fact, messed up by putting the house in Leonard's name. The test came in October of 1969. That's when Leonard Chess died. I heard he was in his car driving around with his mistress, the one I'd met in Muscle Shoals, when he was struck down by a heart attack. Hey. I was shocked and sad and thought that no matter what anyone said, no matter how rough or vulgar he might have been, no matter if he did screw artists out of royalties, I felt something for this man. I thought he had soul. Naturally, I thought about my house and the deed that was under his care. I was especially worried because earlier that year, Leonard had sold Chess to GRT, General Recorded Tape, and I'd been hearing the paperwork was a mess. So I called his lawyers only to learn Leonard didn't even have a will. Where was the deed to my house? The lawyers couldn't help me. I put down the phone and felt like a fool. My friends had been right. I'd been taken. It was only a matter of time before I'd lose the house, my only little piece of security. A week after Leonard's death, I was sitting at home when I heard a knock on the door. A white man in a plain blue suit and gray tie was standing there. He looked like an accountant or a banker. "I'm a friend of Leonard Chess," he said. "Leonard told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to give you this." With that, he reached in his suit pocket and handed me an envelope. Inside was the deed to my house, written out in my name. Even though Leonard never bothered to make a will, he did take the time to make sure I'd keep the fort. To this day, I'm grateful. I know in my heart that if Leonard hadn't snatched the deed from me years before, I would have lost the house to Dorothy or Billy or my love of drugs. Drugs were still playing on my mind. Artis took a strong position against them. He hated the hard stuff, and in fact, he beat up Gene Redding and threw him out of our hippie crash pad when he caught him nodding off. He thought Gene would be a bad influence on me, but in truth, it worked the other way. I was a lot more aggressive about dope than Gene. I was a lot more aggressive than most everyone. I got back into it, and I did it on the sly so artists wouldn't know. There was a dry cleaners down the street owned by my main man, big-time dealer known all over L.A. They called him the Godfather of Central Avenue. This cat always took care of me. I'd go out for long periods of time telling artists that I had to shop. "Hey man," I'd say, "I'm off to the poultry store to buy some chickens." Meanwhile, I'd score dope from the Godfather. When I got home, I'd hide the stuff along with my works under one of those stands that my wig heads, under my wig heads. I'd slide the shit way up into one of those suckers. When artists left the house, I'd fix and shoot. This went on for a few weeks. Finally, artist asked, "Where are those chickens you're always running out to buy?" "They're in the fridge," I told him. "I'm going to cook up some chicken tonight," I said, when I was really thinking of cooking up the smack under my wig head. One day, out of pure instinct, artist opened my closet and looked at all my wig head holders. Must have been a dozen each with a different hairstyle. Wouldn't you know, he went straight for the one that was hiding my heroin. He threw off the wig, reached up, and grabbed the stuff just like that. "The chicken," he said, "is heroin." I didn't argue. Neither did he. He surprised me by saying that he just wanted to meet the dealer. "If you're going to keep doing this," he said, "I'm going to do it with you." I thought he was bluffing. When we got over there, he patiently watched me shoot up. But when I was through, he stuck out his arm, rolled up his sleeve, tied off, and said, "My turn." I didn't like the idea. "I ain't going to do it, artist," I said. "I ain't going to be the one." "The hell you're not," he argued. "If you're going out of this world backwards, I'm following you. Now stick that needle in my arm." And I did. That was the day Mills became a junkie. Unlike me, though, he never became sick. Also, unlike me, he never had trouble finding a vein. If a junkie can be healthy, then Artist was a halfway healthy junkie. Physically and mentally, he was a strong man, always fired up sexually. As time went on, though, dope took some of the fire out of our sex life. When you're shooting heroin, heroin becomes more exciting than sex. But smack never completely debilitated Artist, never broke him down. Next story. Only music brought me up. With Leonard Chess gone and the company sold, Marvin Schlachter took over. Marv was a good guy. Like Leonard, he respected my talent. He maintained my contract and kept me recording even during periods of very heavy drug use. Funny, but when I listened to those records cut at Sunset Sound in LA in the early 70s, I don't hear the negative impact of drugs on my singing. Ray Charles has said the same thing about his vocals when he was a junkie. Don't get me wrong, I'm not telling singers to get high, and I'm not saying it helped, but I don't hear how it hurt. People like me and Ray are peculiar that way. The music or the power of our passion behind the music may be stronger than the dope. I was still doing a mix of different material. The heavy horns were behind me. Songs like Tighten Up Your Own Thing on an album called Etta James Sings Funk. As a concept, funk was suddenly getting lots of play, though black dance music had been funky long as I could remember. Chess was still interested in having me sing ballads with weepy strings. I did tunes like I Got It Bad and The Man I Love. These were songs from my mother's era. Although my producer, the savvy Ralph Bass, had Gene Barge write arrangements that reminded me of Otis Redding's version of Try a Little Tenderness. These ballads were done 60s soul style, bombs bursting, fireworks exploding. There was another explosion in music that had been running a parallel course to soul. For the sake of simplicity, I'll call it white rock. I'm no music historian, but I was right in the middle of this revolution, and I was fascinated by its twists and turns. Just as I'd seen Pat Boone copying Fats Domino and Georgia Gibbs copying me in the 50s. In the 60s, I'd seen the Beatles copying the Isley Brothers and the Rolling Stones copying Muddy Waters. The difference was that this time the white kids, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, were rebels themselves, not conformists. Pat Boone was a cleaned up version of Little Richard, but the Stones weren't interested in being clean. They wanted to dance with the devil. I liked their attitude. I remember seeing, for example, a little white girl come into my concerts when I'd play the Big Ten, a black dance hall in Oklahoma. She'd show up at rehearsal, hanging on my every note. I figured she was the promoter's daughter. No, someone said. She idolizes you. Years later, I was rehearsing for a show at the Whiskey in L.A. It was a closed session with Trevor Lawrence in charge. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw this little white girl sitting in the corner with scraggly hair, velvet coat, and a patchwork dress. She was sipping out of a Southern Comfort bottle and looked like a little old lady. At sessions, I always have an attitude, so I asked Trevor who the hell let her in. "That's Janis Joplin," he said. She just started to get famous, and I wasn't exactly sure who she was. She never came over and said, "I'm sorry, Miss James, I didn't want to disturb you, but..." Wait a minute. She came over and said, "I'm sorry, Miss James, I didn't want to disturb you, but you might remember that I'm the chick who'd watch you rehearse at the Big Ten in Oklahoma." That's when I recognized her and couldn't help but smile. As time went on, my view of Janis changed. At first, I was a little resentful. Some newspapers said it takes black Etta James a lifetime to be a superstar, where white Janis Joplin does it in 2 years. That made me stop and think. Back to Georgia Gibbs. When Georgia copied Roll With Me, Henry, I was young and dumb and pissed at how she stole my song. But the more I heard Janis, the more I saw the difference between white singers in the 50s and 60s. When I, myself, started using white musicians, they'd say, "Janis loves you." My musician pal Keith Johnson swore Janis told him she'd never be anything more than a third-rate Etta James. She gave me respect, and I began feeling proud to be her role model. When I heard her sing, I recognized my influence, but I also heard the electricity and rage in her own voice. She had balls. I loved her attitude. She didn't give a shit what people thought. She dressed the way she pleased, take it or leave it. I dug her with Big Brother and the Holding Company. I liked her version of Irma Franklin's Piece of My Heart. I sang the song myself. And Chris Christopherson's Me and Bobby McGee. Looking back, she was like an angel who came and paved a road white chicks hadn't walked down before. She turned a lot of white folks on to the blues. Janis was a wild one, and I was hoping she'd find a way to chill before it was too late. In that department, though, I could give no advice, since I myself was demonstrating no restraint. When Janet checked out, it hurt my heart. I don't know her story, but in her music I hear confusion and pain. I wish she'd found a way to find peace. I feel a kindred spirit to Janis Joplin, like she's a daughter I never really knew. When I think about that era, I think the fact that white singers, Grace Slick is another one, were looking to black women like me and Aretha for inspiration. For all the creative white groups around, though, I believe that the real revolution was made by 2 black guys, the cats who really changed the shit around, and they were both coming out of the background similar to my own rhythm and blues. I'm talking about Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone. Apollo Faye was probably as close to Egg Foo Young as anyone in life. Remember, Faye was strictly an R&B lady. She wasn't called Apollo for nothing. When it came to music and men, her taste was hardcore soul. She liked her funk uncut. So when she started talking about Jimmy's new music, I listened. His shit was still funky, she said, but acid was taking it in a new direction. Well, I knew a little about acid. I started tripping myself. I really liked mushrooms and enjoyed going to the beach and feeling the effects. Looking at the vast ocean and endless sky over my head, losing a sense of myself in nature. Hey, that was a new sensation. I'm not saying that replaced the immediate jolt of heroin. Heroin remained my drug of choice. But through psychedelics, I could see what the hippies were seeing. A different kind of world where me, myself, and I wasn't the one and only center. That's also what I heard in Jimmy's music. He might twist and bend the notes like Johnny Guitar Watson, but his mind was busy exploring the outer limits. That was exciting. By asking, "Are you experienced?" in his song, Jimmy got a lot of people to start looking for an answer. Sly became a close friend. He was a beautiful cat whose musical personality reminded me of John Watson. Sly was a wizard. He came out of gospel and became a DJ on KDIA in the Bay Area. For years, he had played my records and said he was a fan. Sly was a sweethearted man with beautiful smiling eyes and a golden disposition. He was bashful and humble, an R&B cat who, like Egg Foo Young, had tastes in other areas. For example, when he was still spinning records on black stations, he'd play Bob Dylan and the Beatles. When he formed the Family Stone with his sister and brother and Larry Graham on bass, he kept a down-home feeling, but wasn't scared to experiment. Sly wasn't scared of nothing. His hits like Dance to the Music, Everyday People, Stand, Hot Fun in the Summertime, Thank You, I Want to Take You Higher, and Everybody is a Star hit a happy chord. They were celebrations everyone could relate to. They had a younger feeling than the sounds of the golden era of soul. The lyrics weren't focused on women-man troubles of the kind me and Aretha were describing. Sly was having a different sort of party. He sounded free. Then he'd come back on you with Family Affair, which was dark and mysterious but still funky as midnight. Sly had a bit of the devil in him. He knew the same was true of me. We related. I met him through Charlie Garcia, a kingpin-type promoter who was taking care of me, Gene Redding, and Joe Hicks, paying us a weekly salary to sing at the Backlot in West Hollywood. Like my husband, Sly came from North Texas. In fact, he was crazy about artists and called him his homeboy. He'd invite us to his recording sessions at Paramount just off Vine Street. He'd have his big mobile home sitting there, and whoever was tight and cool with Sly could go in and share his blow. He loved blow. While Sly got high, his engineers would be waiting in the studio. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Sly and me and artists would be snorting lines and popping yellow jackets until 4 or 5 in the morning, when Sly might decide to cut something. When he did, though, watch out. The man was the master. Straight up genius. All the years I've been in the business, I've never seen a talent like Sly's. When it comes to grooves and flat-out feeling, only Otis and James Brown came close. Sly didn't need an engineer. He knew the board better than anyone. He could play all instruments and damn near sing all the tracks. He internationalized R&B, integrated it, slicked it up, and put it out in a way where the whole world loved it. He was futuristic, so advanced that he could hardly keep up with himself. Even today, 25 years later, any terrible groove that comes round here, well, chances are it started with Sly. Sly was Sly. He kept a small house off Sunset Strip, near the whiskey. That's where he'd test out his chicks before he moved them up to his big crib in Bel Air. He had gorgeous women, and you won't be surprised to learn that Apollo Faye was one of them. Faye was the kind who started out as a lover but wound up as a best friend and confidant. She and Sly were tight. At a time when me and artists were down and out on the verge of being raggedy junkies, Sly was the only big star who acted like our brother. Many times he'd come to the fort with his portable piano and write songs all night. He liked being back in the neighborhood. While we snorted heroin, he'd sniff his blow and tell us, "I'm never fooling with smack. Anything that good has to be bad." When he left, he'd always hand me $200 or $300. No questions asked. We'd go up to Bel Air where he'd work in his fabulous home studio. He'd also sing in bed or stretched out on the couch. The place was wired so he could cut anywhere, and we'd just watch, amazed. He asked me to sing a duet with him on Que Sera, Sera, but it never came off. The night of the session, he was too high to work. That's when he was going with Doris Day. I met her up at Sly's along with her son Terry Melcher. I also met the beautiful Eurasian sisters Sly was sleeping with. He finally threw out one and married the other in Madison Square Garden in a wedding thrown by Charlie Garcia. For all his success, Sly was quietly modest and extremely generous. He'd give you the shirt off of his back. His father had to put locks on the food cabinets because the hanger-ons were devouring everything in sight. Etta, Sly said, if the time ever comes when you need something, just holler. Well, that time came pretty goddamn soon. And here's the last story for this chapter. Miss Dakota and Ramon were still close to me, and though they were never lovers, they were each other's best buddy. When I came home from Alaska with artists, Ramon moved out of the fort into an apartment on San Vincent with Miss Dakota. This was a time when Dakota was heavily off into cocaine, both snorting and selling the stuff. She'd even hired a couple of runners, guys, to make deliveries for her. One night, one of those guys and a lady companion came to her apartment. Ramon was in the living room, Dakota in the back bedroom when the doorbell rang. Ramon looked through the peephole, recognized the guy as someone who delivered coke for Dakota, and let him in. His lady stayed with Ramon while he went back to find Dakota, who was sitting up in bed listening to music. According to Ramon, this punk wanted more cocaine but didn't have the money for his last run. Dakota figured he was snorting it up himself. She told him he wasn't getting any more dope till she got her money. Dakota was tough, but the punk wouldn't take no for an answer. He got belligerent. That's when Dakota reached down into the drawer of her night table, where she kept an old raggedy pistol. One way or the other, she was going to get the money out of this guy. He saw that one way or the other, she was going to get the money out of this guy. He saw what she was doing, though, and grabbed her arm. There was a fight. Miss Dakota was no weakling, but she might have been high, because the punk wrestled the gun out of her hand. He shot her twice in the chest. Dakota slumped over and fell to the floor. Hearing the shots, Ramon screamed, but before she could get to the bedroom, the punk stopped her in the hallway and pressed the gun against her temple. Ramon told me she was sure he was going to shoot her brains out. Before the guy and his girlfriend left, they stole Dakota's cash and ripped the rings off her fingers. Back in the bedroom, Ramon found Dakota bleeding and hyperventilating like crazy. Rather than call 911, Ramon was scared because the apartment was loaded with drugs. She called a friend who rushed Dakota to the hospital. The bullets had punctured Dakota's lungs. She was bleeding internally, and the poor thing was writhing in pain. Her death was horrible. It took her 3 days of fearful screaming and crying. Losing Miss Dakota was a nightmare for me. She was one of the only people I could count on. She was no bullshit, funny, nervy, and always in my corner. When I was down in the dumps, Miss Dakota could make me laugh. She made me feel good about myself, and I tried to do the same with her. But now look at her, laid out in a pink negligee at the Ashley Grigsby Funeral Home on Central Avenue. Still an outrageous drag queen in death. I had to laugh and cry at the same time. She had a full wig on her head and pink fingernail polish, pink lipstick on her little pucker lips. Even the pillow supporting her head was pink. Her face was covered with the whitest powder you could imagine, and her eyes, I'll never forget this, her eyes were halfway open. She looked beautiful. On the side of her casket was a cheesy picture of the Last Supper. Ramon and I were sitting there trying to comfort each other. The terror of the murder was still in the air. Everyone was jumpy. We really jumped, though, when the angry-looking guy walked through the door. "Oh, God," Ramon whispered in my ear, "that's Dakota's father. Lord have mercy." The man went crazy when he saw his child. "This isn't my son," he screamed. "This isn't Harold Johnson." Well, it was, and it wasn't. Harold Johnson had changed identities to those of us who knew and loved him best. He had become she, and she was Miss Dakota. But the old man couldn't accept that fact, so he had the body taken away, the makeup removed, and the pink negligee replaced by a pinstriped business suit. Ramon thought it was wrong, and I did too, but who was going to start up at a time like that? Sure, the old man was in deep denial, and sure, Miss Dakota was entitled to her last drag in public. She looked sensational. The next day, Ramon, still trembling from the grisly murder, disappeared, afraid the punk who killed Dakota would come after her. I heard she caught a Greyhound home to Pittsburgh, hauling trunks filled with Dakota's gowns and jewels. Later, someone said she died in a car wreck. Hard times continued, especially for me and Mills. Our habit was growing. The truth is that our habit was turning us into jivask criminals. And that is the end of chapter 24. I've been reading Rage to Survive, the Etta James story. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you.